Hello, everybody, and welcome to this event of Science Breaks at Imperial College. It is a new event series, which is created and run by the institutional events team. My name is Tommaso Valletti. I'm Professor of Economics at Imperial College Business School, where I'm also heading the Department of Economics and Public Policy. I'm delighted today to introduce a lecture and, in fact, a conversation with Professor Maurizio Zollo. Professor Zollo is a professor of strategy and sustainability, also at Imperial College Business School. He's heading the Department of Management, and he's also the director of the Leonardo Centre. You will hear what they do in those places from Maurizio himself. Maurizio is a very well accomplished scholar. His topic is going to be entrepreneurship, corporate social responsibility, but you will hear his views about reinventing capitalism in a couple of minutes. He joined Imperial just over a year ago. Before that, he was at Bocconi University. He's also taught at Sloan School at MIT and in SEAD and other places. Apart from being a very accomplished academic and scholar, Maurizio has also an experience in the real world. He was a strategy consultant at McKinsey, and he also worked as an investment banker at Merrill Lynch. As far as I am concerned, just to give you a little bit of background, as I said, I'm a professor of economics. I do research in economics, and in particular, I look at market power, the causes and the consequences of market power. And I joined Imperial a long time ago, but I also came back in 2019 with Maurizio because I left academia for a while. Between 2016 and 2019, I was the chief economist for competition at the European Commission in Brussels. So we have probably a complementary view. Maurizio will tell you a lot of things about corporate strategy, but I've seen corporations, the big corporation, from an institutional setting when it comes to competition. So I have perhaps a complementary view to what Maurizio is going to be saying. Before we start, let me just do a second of housekeeping. You're all invited to submit questions. You have a Q&A bar, and you can submit your questions there. I will moderate that bar, and you can send any question you want at any time. I'll keep an eye on it. Please be aware that the event is recorded, and it will also be put on YouTube later on. So if you don't want your name to be read when you're asking a question, because I will be reading your question eventually, please do it in an anonymous way. And that's about it. So I'm going to hand over to Maurizio. Maurizio and I plan to have an initial presentation, initial thoughts by Maurizio for about 10-15 minutes, and then we will have a chat. So over to you, Maurizio.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank all of you, first of all, for being attending, being present today, and all of you who will also look at this conversation afterwards. The topic is clearly quite central in many discussions at many levels, right? The political level as well as the business level. Reinventing capitalism. What I'm going to basically give you my own view. Why do we need to reinvent it? What is the problem essentially? And what is the general conceptual, theoretical solutions, which I'll say, immediately has to do with what people call stakeholder capitalism. It's been discussed in many contexts, as I said, at all levels. But I will try to focus most of the attention on the problem of realizing this grand vision, right? I will define stakeholder capitalism a bit like nirvana, right? It's basically everything would be working wonderfully well if all companies in the world would behave the way that the principles of stakeholder capitalism dictated. Unfortunately, none of the companies existing today. Companies are not created, have not been created. There will be exceptions to this. There are exceptions on entrepreneurial concerns that have just recently been created, which actually abide to some of these principles. But fundamentally, the real problem is one of understanding how the system can transition towards this high level characterization and set of principles. So why to reinvent capitalism? Well, there are many potential answers, obviously, to this question. I'm going to focus on one, also because we're going to have a chance to discuss with all of you and with Tommaso that potentially other answers. The one answer that I'm going to propose to you is that essentially we have a problem of excessively narrow definition of the central word of capitalism, which is capital, right? We have been focusing on the notion of capital essentially as financial capital. We all know that that is only one way and one type, one form of capital that is absolutely essential for the creation, the growth and the success of firms, just as well as financial capital, human capital, all right, the skills and capabilities of employees, social capital, the quality of the relationships that the company has with the rest of the world, and natural capital, right? So the quality of the raw material, the earth, also the access to land, water, and air, also for pollution, which is necessary in production and logistics. Those are all necessary forms and actually fundamental forms. So the interesting problem that we're facing is that the primacy that has been given to the financial form of capital actually made a lot of sense when capitalism was developing, particularly in the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. Why? Oh, because it was the real bottleneck, right? At that time, workforce was abundant, demand was there, suppliers were available, and the land, the natural capital was still relatively unpolluted and free to use for everyone, or relatively free. The real bottleneck for the success of any firm was the availability of financial capital. Now, fast forward, a good century after that, towards the end of the last century and definitely the beginning of ours, the situation is exactly the opposite. Financial capital, precisely because of the efficiency in financial markets, has become basically commodity. It is not anymore the source of competitive advantage. You cannot build a competitive advantage on the fact that you have more money than your competitor. Why? Because money will come if you have great ideas, if you have great relationships, if you have special access to natural capital. So all the other forms of capital are really the root of competitive advantage, and financial capital follows essentially. So why are we having the problem? Well, the situation is as I described, but unfortunately the rules of the system, the norms, both social norms and legal rules, are still by and large the ones that were created back in the end of the 19th century or early 20th century. That's one form of problem. So this becomes essentially the reason why many voices are calling for a redesign of the fundamental rules of the capitalist system. By the way, the problem with the the reason why everybody's calling for these new rules is clearly the symptoms are all there, right? We are living unprecedented times where you have simultaneously not only health crisis, economic crisis, social crisis, inequity and injustice everywhere, and of course the ethical, if you want to add, ethical crisis as well, with corruption, and unethical behavior spread out across both developing and developed countries. So those are the symptoms, but the if you want, the root cause could be pointed to the narrow definition and the primacy given to one form of capital. Now, what is the solution? As I was saying, there's been this debate on the notion of stakeholder capital. What is stakeholder capitalism? Essentially, it is can be defined as basically the system whereby all the business organizations have integrated in their purpose the notion, the interest, the needs of all the investors in all the various forms of capital, right? Now, this means, first of all, that the businesses have to change, right? Adapt the purpose, right? But more importantly, all the fundamental pieces of the engine of a business organization, the governance rules, the strategic decision-making processes, the content of the strategy. How do you compete, perhaps much more cooperatively in a stakeholder logic than competitively? The notion of growth itself, right, needs to be rethought. For instance, obviously this comes together with dramatic changes in the incentive systems, in the control systems, innovation processes, and fundamentally the nature of the leadership and the culture of the organization need to be profoundly adapted. Now, that's all nice to say, and it's been described from a theoretical standpoint for decades. Okay, this is nothing new in theory. The novelty is that now it's actually the CEOs of pretty much all listed companies all over the world that talks this language. The novelty is that at the World Economic Forum, with all the heads of states that attend and so on, next year, for instance, the big theme will be the Great Reset, right? Implying that the objective is to redesign, from scratch, the way that we are conceiving and running a new model, a new way of managing economic activity. So if everyone seems to point in that direction, then what's wrong? Why is this an issue? Well, it is a fundamental issue for both policy as well as for business. And that's where I look forward to our conversation, Tommaso. I see it as a fundamental issue because there is no magic formula on the transition, on how to facilitate this transition. First of all, the way that businesses, right? I'm going to start from there because that's my area of expertise, of course. But the way that businesses have tackled so far all these issues, first of all, starts from a risk reduction perspective, right? I want to invest in looking good and in doing good things, simply because if I don't, I have a significant risk of having customers, employees, investors. By the way, investors themselves are now singing the same songs. The largest investors, the BlackRocks, the Amundi, now are issuing studies and direct letters to the CEOs that they're investing in, asking them to basically make the case for their social impact, not only the economic impact. But first of all, the risk reduction is an important element, but it's the beginning of a whole evolutionary cycle. Then it gets into efficiency logics, and many companies have made this move from a risk approach to an efficiency approach, right? It pays less if you reduce the energy costs. Obviously, it's good for the earth, it's good for the bottom line. There is another step which is a lot more complex, which is thinking about all these issues in terms of innovation. So essentially as drivers of the new products, new process development, new business models. That's, I would say, where the frontier today is. So the most advanced companies have kind of evolved in their mindset, in their logic, in their purpose, in defining these set of issues as drivers of their innovation. What has not happened yet, though, is all the rest of the stuff that I was talking about before, right? The redefinition of the purpose, redesigning of governance. The board of directors do not include representatives of all the stakeholders today, even in the most advanced companies on this dimension. Strategic processes and so on and so forth. None of that part really has been significantly touched yet. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. It requires, and here is the whole idea of reinventing, it requires, because there is no magic formula, it requires a foundational effort of innovation and experimentation. So every company and every government, every policymakers needs to try a number of alternative options on how to redesign the governance or the incentive systems and so on, how to design interventions from a policy perspective and see what works, what doesn't. The fundamental problem here is that in order to drive this experimentation, we need the evidence, the data of what works when I do X rather than Y to solve the same problem.
Before we go into the evidence, and we will want to get there, I want, if you allow me, to react to a couple of things you said and start asking you some questions that I have and some people also will have. First, I will ask you the classical economist question, which I don't believe in, by the way, personally. But the first question is, take this debate has been going on for decades, and take the view of Milton Friedman. And Milton Friedman said a company has no social responsibility whatsoever to the public or society. They should respond only to the shareholders, because that's what the mission of a company is. Shareholders is actually the economic engine, according to Milton Friedman. You spoke about engines. And so a company has to maximize returns, profits for the shareholders, and then will be up to an individual choice that single individuals will decide what social innovations they want to take part to. So it's an individual choice. So the risk of having the goals which are too different from the pursuit of profit is that it may dilute the mission of a company. You don't know exactly what you should be doing. So how do you react to that? Or more different, is there, so I would put it differently, is there a trade-off? Is there a trade-off or not? Or can you make profits by doing good as well? I mean, is there? This is the Milton Friedman. How do you respond to Milton Friedman and to this right-wing view of the firm?
This is a debate, again, that has been going on. Now, the good news about the last couple of decades, let's say 20 or 30 years after Milton Friedman, the evidence speaks against the notion of trade-off, right? But fundamentally, because the underlying assumption that Milton Friedman was making, and again, also with him, most of the economists still make, is that the investments in in the social responsibility, whatever has been labeled sometimes as a corporate social responsibility, is made kind of outside the interest, outside the scope of business. So basically, it's philanthropy. Yeah, that has nothing to do with what we're talking about here, right? It's not about philanthropy. It's not about giving away money to the community and so on to look good. Precisely, in fact, it's the opposite. Is the fact that there are investors, right? The employees, as I was saying, right, and the communities need to be compensated for the investments that they make, right? The license to operate, the land and the water and the air that they allow the company to pollute, those are investments. The people that are willing to work for the company or trade with the company that live in that community, those again is social capital invested in the success of the company. For those investments, they require some form of return, which is fair enough. Part of that return is taxes, right? And what seems to be pretty clear is that that's not enough. Certainly, it's not enough for employees and for suppliers and so on and so forth. So the trade-off logic, it doesn't make sense specifically because we're talking about an integral way of doing business, right? Governance and so on. The second problem is the second good news in a way is that actually the evidence speaks it very clearly. The companies, and this is not just scientific. First of all, there's credible scientific evidence published in the last decade from both management and different disciplines that shows that the companies, if you do a match comparison, companies that have invested in these type of returns to the other forms of capital have actually created more returns, better returns also for the financial investors. All right, so that basically, and by the way, this has been replicated also by investors, by financial investors, as I was saying, the BlackRocks and the Amundis of the day. And that's why more and more companies now are getting kind of convinced that this makes sense, not only for the stakeholders, so the non-shareholding stakeholders, but also for the shareholders themselves, or for the investors.
So again, two things I want to ask about. So take the BlackRock, they make these announcements, okay, that they want to do good stuff, they want to care about the environment. So they go to places like Davos, and you have these top executives of the top companies that they look really good when they speak about these things. And then this comes my personal experience when I was chief economist in Brussels, and we had to deal with passive investors and the rise in power that the passive investors have. And there were concerns because passive investors may also coordinate their actions together. That's similar to collusion. So when we did big mergers like in Bayer Monsanto, which had environmental concerns, but also market power concerns, we saw that there was a system of common ownership that was worrying. And so we were asking the same, BlackRock and Vanguard, etc. But sorry, is this good or bad? Can you also do these actions in order to increase prices and do things which are bad for end users? And they would simply say, no, we are passive investors. We cannot dictate anything to firms. So in a sense, these companies, they say they can coordinate their actions only if they do good things. But when it comes to bad things, instead they have no words whatsoever. So
That also is equally problematic. The way that I see it is
why do we need to believe when they make good statements and instead?
No, I don't think we need to believe, and we have passed the time of, the trust me kind of narrative, right? We need to believe only in actions and the impact on action. That's why we need the data on the initiatives, not the data only on impacts, right? We're focusing a lot on the data on, measuring the carbon, footprints and the social impacts. That's not even. But unless and until we have data on the behaviors, on the actual initiatives, the action, the way that they run their business, and then, of course, how that influences financial and non-financial performance, we're not going to go anywhere. Now, for what concerns financial institutions, they have exactly the same problems of other sectors. Exactly the same transition needs to happen. In fact, it's even more important and urgent that they undertake the same transformation in purpose, governance, and so on, strategies, and so on, incentive systems, control systems. Why? Because, as it's obvious, they play a central role on all the other sectors, right? They provide the capital for growth, and they can direct, right? They can decide how to motivate, right? How to direct the attention. They can decide to basically price, say, a loan, right? Much better, much lower costs if the company is showing that it's using those monies to make this transition, for instance, right? So they have not only the same problem of transition and showing that they are actually behaving differently, but they have the responsibility, which is much, much greater than any of the other sectors. Is that enough?
Yeah. It's a very good answer. What I liked in what you said earlier is that, thanks to your research, also you are trying to understand how a stakeholder approach to the firm is having an impact on the performance of the firm, and you try to basically have a group of firms which follow certain principles, and you compare it with a control group of firms that do not. Okay, so and that's a typical empirical approach you follow in these cases, and you try to see the differential performance of this organization, and you say that under some conditions there is no really any trade-off. It's not that the profits are going to go down.
In fact, there's a synergy, right?
There's a synergy there. Yeah. But then my point is, because this is a topic which is very dear to me, when we deal with big corporation, where the real money is, and the top 5 companies in the world by market capitalizations today are GAFAM, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. And you cannot find another Google with or without corporate social responsibility. So how do we think about these companies in the digital sphere where there is no firm you can compare to? Because there is only one with very large market power and control of our lives. So, and these companies, what they do is, yes, they also sometimes do something that looks good. They say that we give you for free the contact tracing app, but then they don't pay taxes. So is this something that they're using just in order to look good on the paper? And then the real responsibilities they have, Amazon or Exxon, whatever, Exxon is polluting the world. They may actually fund a chair for the preservation of the turtle in the sea, but we don't want Exxon to fund a chair for preservation of turtles. We want Exxon not to damage the environment. So there are much more important things out there. So how do we deal with your topics when it comes to very large corporations?
I think the answer to this core question, particularly for people like you and me who are trying to do the best possible research on these topics, lies in the fact that the methodologies, once you have, so the large scale, matched pair analysis that I was referring to works very well when you want to make the general case. You want to make the general point that there is no trade-off, and in fact there is a synergy, and that is against, across sectors, across geographies, and that general point has been made. But you're perfectly right. When it comes to the individual company, that is meaningless, right? You're not comparing. There is no such thing as the average company, right? In a given sector, and especially when you have companies with that level of market power, you don't have comparisons. But at that point, you need to change your methodology. And what we're trying to do, for instance, in the Leonardo Centre that we created about a year ago, is to engage companies, by the way, some of those large companies that you were mentioning as well as others, obviously, not just the big guys, in a program of, first of all, kind of assessing in an objective way the impact of what they have already done, right? All of them do hundreds of initiatives on different fronts, across all the sustainable development goals. We have developed a unique digital data set with about 5 million sustainability initiatives by 13,000 companies, analyzing automatically with machine learning more than 100,000 sustainability reports. So we basically have a pretty good understanding of what companies have been doing, because they not only we identify the initiative, but we also categorize them across the sustainable development goals, all the 17 goals, and about 14 different behavioral categories. So we know what they have done in order to achieve or contribute to each of the sustainable development goals. Well, the point is, each company needs to, first of all, understand the impact of what they have done, what worked, what didn't work, why, and so on. There's that learning process that at this stage is still really to be put in place, okay? They do all sorts of stuff, but it's totally disjointed. They do this and that and so on. There is no strategy within the sustainability area, let alone linking all that stuff with the real kind of what they would call real competitive strategy, growth strategy, and so on. And so, there is first of all a question of understanding what has happened, the history, the baseline, if you want. Then the next problem is, okay, what is you need a collective learning, right? They need to learn from each other, because some of these things that someone has tried must have worked much better than others, right? So there is that learning, collective learning, that needs to be put in place. And finally, there is that experimentation that I was talking about, where what we do, for example, within Leonardo, is creating what we call collabs, right? Collaboratories, where companies not only share what they've done, and we help them evaluate the impacts of what they've done, but also co-create, co-invent new ways of solving the problems. And then they can experiment in pilot projects. We help them there too, to experiment, to design, appropriate randomized controlled trials, right? That would allow them to understand what works best, what is the best incentive system, what is the best control system or governance system, right? By trying different approaches across, say, different subsidiaries, for instance.
Maurizio, I'm going to stop you because the Q&A bar is very hot. It's never been hotter, so I'll try to give you maybe questions in very quickly, 3 or 4, and then you can give a quick answer, and so then we can move on. So somebody is saying, well, how to redefine GDP accounting for externalities, because we're talking about positive, negatives. How can we redefine GDP accounting for these externalities? Then David Irwin is saying, what about this tension between it's short-termism. You want to make money, but climate change is a long-term issue. Is there a clash between the short-term and the long-term? How to deal with that? And the third question, very quickly, if you can answer that or say something. Somebody, an anonymous question is something which this person cannot really understand. This assumption that the capitalist system is based on continuous growth over time, and since the resources are limited, how can we physically continue to grow? How do we account for that? So I will give you these three questions. Apologies. Every question can go on for long answers, but I prefer to keep it short so we can answer.
The accounting one. So the good news is that there are a number now of institutions that are being created precisely to provide the metrics and the ways in which the accounting system, the control systems of companies can be adjusted and adapted. So I can talk about the IIRC, the International Integrated Reporting Committee. There is the SASB. I mean, those of you who are interested, please shoot me an email. I'll be happy to provide the. But there is a major movement now in focused on developing better and better systems, control systems, precisely on this question. On the short-termism, this is a fundamental problem. It is primarily a problem in the financial sector, right? Investors. As I said, the good news is that at least the leaders, the biggest managers of financial capital seem to be seeing the light, at least the way that they consistently now are putting their money at work, or their clients' money at work, is now becoming a serious amount. I think the latest estimate talks about 30 trillion, which is not a trivial figure. Yes, we still have the problem, but it's primarily psychological. It's primarily, in our mindset, which brings to the biggest, in my view, is the hardest nut to crack of the whole thing, which is what are the most effective ways, learning processes in order to help managers, investors, all the actors to actually develop a sensitivity, right? A sustainability mindset. A long-term orientation is one of the dimensions of this mindset. That is a question that I've been working on for about a decade. We've been doing a lot of experiments. We don't have time now, but if you're interested, happy to share the results of that question.
Thank you.
The third one, and I forgot that, growth. Now, yes, what I was talking about before in terms of neglecting the role of the natural capital speaks, precisely to that point. Yeah, we have one Earth, and if we keep on, strategizing, right, creating corporate strategies, as if we could live, in 3 or 4 planets, right, basically without boundaries to growth. That's not only unrealistic, but it's self-destructive, right? And so, but that hasn't, everybody understands this, right, when you say it. But then when you look at how the strategic planning processes work within the companies, that hasn't down on people the fact that, no, growth is not good per se. Right? We need to actually understand the boundaries and put them in our plans, in our strategizing processes.
A question from Joao that resonates well with me. I'm going to read a bit of a question, but then I will elaborate myself before asking you to say something. So, is redesigning capitalism just a mechanism driven by the ones who hold the monopoly on the economic system to maintain power by tweaking. And this is a question of Joao, and I'm going to give you an example. And the example comes from Amazon, which is a company which is worth almost two trillion US dollars now, and we know that Bezos has become the richest man on earth. So Amazon, for many years, created, obviously they have a great business model, they're great in logistics, but also great at escaping rules and navigating across the avoidance of particular taxation and other things. One area which has been quite remarkable has been one of product liability. So if you buy a product on Amazon and the product is a fake product, comes from China, or is faulty, Amazon always claimed it had no liability whatsoever. Instead, if you buy a product in Walmart will have the liability for that. And they argued for ages that there was a fundamental difference in the role that Amazon was playing. Until recently, somebody made a complaint. Somebody bought a battery for a laptop in the US. The battery arrived from China, and the battery exploded. And Amazon, as usual, said, and this person got injured. So the person went after Amazon. Amazon made the usual speech that they didn't have any liability, but this person went to court. And for the first time, a California court said, yeah, you're right, Amazon is liable. And when now the things are changing, what has been extraordinary has been the reaction of Amazon, that instead of defending themselves, arguing, no, we have nothing to do, they said, okay, you may be right, but then we need to impose the same liability to everyone else. And this is, and in particular, they want to impose rules which are even more stringent. So in a sense, using the economist jargon, creating a barrier to entry, because a small company would not have the resources of Amazon to ensure a lot of things in the consumer experience. So Amazon now has changed completely the regulatory system in its own favor in order to preempt further entry into the industry, which is a little bit what Joao is actually saying. So isn't this once again, you got hold of monopoly in a certain way, and now you're using a new way of thinking to keep it, to maintain it. What do you think?
To the extent there's a very, very strong argument to be suspicious about the way in which both powerful actors are handling this transition process. They clearly and Amazon is not the only one. Okay, once they have made the investments, right, to make these changes in their environmental impact, right, to reduce the carbon footprint, or to improve the quality of living on their employees and whatever. This obviously requires some investments. Then they have all the incentives, right, to claim, oh, everybody else has to do it, and to some extent, it's hard to fail them for that, right? They would say, I've done my homework. Now I want you, government in particular, to make sure that also all the other students in the class are making their homework, right? I think that's a fair standing. What is not fair is the fact that there is no support for the other weaker students, if you want, in the class, right? The ones that don't have the resources and the capabilities. They might be living in with poor families and so on, and they would have the hardest time, obviously, to catch up. So it's the responsibility of the teacher, i.e. the government, to actually make sure that those are the ones that are supported. And there are a lot of ways in which the government can support, particularly SMEs, in order to catch up vis-a-vis large companies, right? You can imagine tax advantages. You can imagine advantages on accessing financial capital with banks and other players. You can imagine advantages in accessing public procurement. I mean, all sorts of ways, right? But that we still haven't seen, right? So that's why it's unfair. It's a good competition, right? So competition now has actually turned from a race to the bottom to the race to the virtue, right? To the top, which is a big deal, right? I'm not complaining about that, as long as the government, plays, creates the level playing field, as everybody mentions, particularly with SMEs.
So 3 more questions from the audience very quickly. Stephen is saying, well, forming a company is a privilege. Should we change the legal aims of a company so that it must legally benefit more than the shareholders? So shall it become a legal requirement?
So the interesting thing is that actually, as of today, there is nothing written, not even in the law of the state of Delaware, where most U.S. companies are chartered. There's nothing that says that the board has to prioritize the interest of shareholders vis-a-vis the other stakeholders. Absolutely not. If you read it, it says that the responsibility of the board is for the benefit and the well-being of the company and of its shareholders.
Interesting.
Okay? That's the way it says it. And so right now we already could be using, and this is across the world. I mean, I'm giving you the most extreme, conservative example. You can imagine that in Europe we're much farther ahead on that front. So we could create the governance already that not only gives representation to the various investors of different forms of capital, but for instance, would put in rules in which a company can decide to put in rules that would also have sharing of the retained earnings, right? Rather than distributing them only in the form of dividends to shareholders, you can have rebates for customers, special bonuses. They are already there, obviously, but not only for the CEOs but more generalized to employees. I mean, you can design already much more open and flexible systems at the governance level and within also particularly in the strategic decision making processes. So there's nothing in the law that would prohibit it. Obviously, you can still improve it and make it even more. So there is a concept of benefit corporation, where the charter specifically talks about, requires all this stakeholder orientation. But that's one way of doing it. It's very nice, but can be replicated with the existing regulation. That's my point.
There's a question from Ellen. Ellen is saying, well, overall capitalism has generated many benefits, so it's not an unreasonable model. And she wonders whether we should instead explore more the influence of political models. So we need is better, purer realization of democracy in order to normalize the global economy. So rather than changing perhaps something within the firm, is more the political process that should change.
Sorry, it's interesting. Are we talking about the political processes within the firm or the political processes within the whole system?
It seems to me, but again, Ellen, I'm not Ellen, it seems to be more the latter, so the system.
Okay. Obviously, the whole question about what is the appropriate political system is slightly outside the scope of this discussion. I see the importance of giving, thinking about the role of the government in terms of, pushing or at least informing and supporting this transition, right? There is a whole learning processes, innovation, and experimentation I was talking about. Now, the interesting question becomes, what is the type of political structure, political system that would facilitate that type of role, right? Facilitate the government to take up that role. I'm not sure that there is an answer to that, but of course, we are seeing the evidence of a much stronger predisposition, for instance, in not only Scandinavian models, but also more generally European models of governance, of political governance. They're more predisposed, but that doesn't mean much that they actually will have the stamina to support this historical transformation process. Okay.
There are a bunch of so there are questions that can be grouped. What are the solutions from, say, bottom up, which is like a regulatory system, as opposed to top down, as opposed to bottom up from consumers? In particular, somebody saying possibly a good adjustment should come from the bottom, from consumers, that should take into account their externalities. And that's a good question, but I'm not sure it's so easy to achieve that. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Let me give you a couple of examples. So again, related to digital platforms. We mentioned Amazon before. Amazon is great. Amazon delivers products to our doors very quickly. And and we have become a little bit passive also in accepting, because everything is in our Amazon Prime profile. We just make a click, and we don't think through the consequences. So Amazon is delivering in the single city of New York, something like 2 billion packets every year. So this has environmental consequences. There's also consequences on the local community, because obviously they're very efficient and they crash the competition from the corner shop, which is a little bit changing also the nature of the places we live. But when we ultimately buy our packet on Amazon, we don't think about it. Or think of Uberization. Uber, yes, when it exists, we love it. It's the app, it's easy, they come, and it's cheap. But we don't think that part of the competitive advantage of Uber comes from the fact that the drivers they're not compensated for holidays, for social security. So what is the solution? The solution is, regulations allowing drivers, say, to collectively bargain with Uber for better terms, which is something that the legislation doesn't allow us because it would be like a cartel. Or the solution comes from us individuals looking through the consequences. So maybe both. But what do you think?
The way that I see it is that there are 4 fundamental mechanisms, playing in the various, if you want, markets in which any company competes. Now, of course, one of them is the regulatory market, if you want, right? Making sure that they get the right kind of regulation, if you want, and that's the obvious. It's not a real market, but it is a bargaining context for pretty much most sectors. But then there are the product markets, and clearly the responsibility there is on customers to become more aware, and maybe for government to force companies, especially those with the largest market power, to disclose the impact of their activities, right? So if when you make an order on Amazon, you were told, the carbon footprint of that particular solution, that might actually also change. And in any case, it is important for customers to be aware of the general performance of the company, not only in terms of economic, they don't really care as long as the price is right, but also the social and environmental impacts. Most companies today, including the big ones that you've seen, are receiving increasing pressures from their customers on their social and environmental responsibilities. The other one, of course, is the investors. Investors for sure are playing a role, right? So, and as we talked about already, and the last ones are the communities. That is still not kind of as strong as the others. Certainly, it becomes clear that those type of impacts, if local communities want to solve their environmental and social issues, they will need to learn how to engage and, in a way, put the right type of pressure on companies to behave the right way. They haven't figured that out yet, but it's getting there, right? More and more.
Maurizio, you started the conversation by saying that the typical definition of capital has been too narrow, and you made it broader to encompass natural capital, environmental capital. What about workers? Because one of the topics that one of the trends we've witnessed in the past many years, which are generating the consequence you told about politics and instability and tension, is also huge rise in inequality. So how can the stakeholder society take into account the role played by workers within the firm?
I have actually mentioned human capital as one of the four, right? There's financial, human, social, and natural capital. Human capital is all about employees, and it's all about the investments that they're making, right? They're actually entrusting the companies with their life, right? With their not only with having the paycheck at the end of the month, but actually with their potential for learning, for becoming better professionals, and so on and so forth, right? So it's arguably one of the most important core investments that could be made in the success of the company. So that is, as I said, it's become central. When I was talking about the fact that the most advanced companies are now realizing that all these issues of social and environmental impact can be the drivers of innovation, can be the drivers of competitive advantage, it's fundamentally because that's the other market that I didn't mention in the previous question. The labor market is increasingly sensitive to this, right? So if you want to get the best engineers, the best salespeople, the best managers, you better have something really good to show, not just to say, but to show about what the company is doing vis-a-vis the Sustainable Development Goals and the kind of track record of what has been done. Again, it's the data that matters. It's not just the statements.
Thank you, Maurizio. 1:30 London time is approaching, and I'm reminded that we have to come to a close. There have been a lot of questions. There are 40 now in the bar, and those questions will be read to all of you, and to Maurizio in particular. I'm sure they can be food for thought, so we could go on and continue this conversation with all the inputs you gave us. I really would like to thank Professor Zollo for this very interesting conversation and thought-provoking ideas he had, and also a positive approach to a new market economy, and we can make it. And I want to thank everybody for joining Science Breaks. I also would like to remind you that Science Breaks, this series of initiatives at Imperial College, continues. In particular, September 10th at 12:30 London town, there is going to be another lecture by Professor Pierluigi Dragotti. It seems that Imperial College is run by Italians these days. That's great. I'm very proud of that. And in particular, Professor Dragotti will be talking about his research that enabled him to reveal an abandoned composition between Leonardo da Vinci's Virgin on the Rocks, one of the most beautiful paintings ever. So thank you very much for attending. And that's the end of the event. And we cannot give a round of applause to Maurizio collectively, but I will try at least individually. Thank you very much, Maurizio. Thanks a lot.
For running a great event from your own chairman perspective. It was a really good, really enjoyable and hopefully fruitful discussion for everybody, including myself. Thank you.
Thank you. And goodbye, everybody.